I want to demonstrate how to use a lookup function. Particularly, I will be demonstrating how to use the VLOOKUP function. And this is a really good tool when it comes down to trying to look for specific data in a spreadsheet in the database that looks like this. So we are dealing with some sales transaction data, and this is some data where there's a firm that sells instructional fitness books and DVDs. Now we have quite a few records that we're dealing with here. So it could be a little time consuming if you're trying to look for a specific record. Now, let's say, for example, there's a customer service representative and they're trying to look up information related to a customer ID. So the customer gives them their identification number, and from there, the representative would be able to look at different information. Let's say, for example, one of that information that they're trying to look for is what payment type they used. So VLOOKUP could be very useful when it comes down to this. So let me demonstrate how you could work with this tool. Now there are different ways that you can use this function. So let me just go ahead and demonstrate one of those ways. I'm gonna hit the equal sign and just select this cell so I can have the same type of label. And what I want is when somebody wants to type in the customer ID here, this right here, what will show will be the payment type based off of that customer ID. So I'll go ahead and just put uh, payment. I'm just going to select the cell reference here. I can just type in payment, but this is a shortcut so you just won't have to worry about retyping things. Now, let's go ahead and assume that the person is going to just deal with the first record here. Like, let's say a customer ends up calling and gives the ID 10001. So I'll go ahead and just hard type that here as a reference. I can type in equal sign since I am going to be using the VLOOKUP function and type that in, or I could, with any function, not just the VLOOKUP, I can just click on FX and look for the function that I want to use. So I'll just type in VLOOK and see if anything comes out. No. All right. So let's see. If I were to select lookup and reference, and then from there look up that one, VLOOKUP, I'll press OK. And this is a really good feature to use if you're unfamiliar with some of these functions and what each of the arguments would represent. So you'll notice here we have several arguments. Those that are in bold are the ones that are required uh, and must be filled out to be able to use that function, and those that are non-bold are optional. And as you click on the text box, you have little help area that gives you an idea of what you're supposed to do or what this argument i- is all about. So for the lookup value, that's going to be the first argument. The lookup value will be, we're going to say the lookup value is going to be the customer ID. So I am going to, now it's not going to be the customer ID that we already have in this database. It's going to be the area where they're going to type in that value. So I'm going to say in this spreadsheet, this will be the area where somebody will type in that value, and then the payment type will automatically reflect right next to it. So I selected K3. Now for the table array, this is going to be the entire data set that we're working on. I'm going to exclude the labels, so it's just going to be the records here. I'll select all of that. When you're using VLOOKUP, so to avoid any sort of errors, it's a good idea to use the absolute reference. So I'm going to put those signs on the table array here. The next text box here is saying what column index number, and it says here in this documentation, it says is the column number in table underscore array from which the matching value should be returned. So the column number. Now, if customer ID is column number 1, and I'm interested in outputting the payment, that would be column 3, right? So customer ID is column 1, region is column 2, payment is column 3. So I'll put the column number as number 3. I'm gonna leave range lookup blank just because my customer ID here is already sorted. And I don't have to worry about putting any sort of value here. But if my customer ID, my first column here, was not sorted, then I would want to indicate a certain value here. And if it wasn't sorted, I would say false. But since it is sorted, I can either put true or just leave it blank. So I'll just leave it blank, and I'm going to press OK. And notice what ends up happening is this here on L3, we got this value PayPal, and this is the payment type for that customer. Now I can change this number to whatever I want, uh, as long as that customer ID is inside our database here. So we know, for example, we have this customer, and I'll just go ahead and copy that value. And this person used credit as their payment type. So if I go back to my VLOOKUP and just type in that customer ID, it automatically outputs what payment type that customer used. And you can do this for whatever it is that you want to output. So if there's additional information that you want to output as as you type in the customer ID, you'll just use that VLOOKUP function similarly to how I just did that right now. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a copy of this worksheet, and I'm going to create a copy, move it to the end, and this is my second worksheet here. Okay, so let's say, for example, I want to add an additional column or change the information that's going to be outputted based off of the customer ID. Now, the question is, what information do I want to be outputted? I could easily just go back to the VLOOKUP and that I've created here, and say, for example, I want to look up the source. So instead of column number 3, I know source is, let's see, if this is 3, 4, 5, I can change this to number 5 and hit enter. And then we'll go ahead and select that first customer in the database to make sure it's working. And it says here web, and that is the case. So this now is not payment, this is the source. So here's a different example. I have the sales data, the sales transaction information here, and I want to create a new worksheet. And this is going to be the worksheet where I do the lookup function. And I'm just going to leave this worksheet that contains all the sales transaction data. And I'll say, for example, customer ID. And the information that I want here will be, let's say, I want to display both the payment information and source together. So I'll just go ahead and select payment. I'll hit the equal sign, go to the worksheet and select the cell that I want. And I have source. So these are referencing another data sheet. And you can see when I put the active cell here, look at the FX, it's referring to the data worksheet E3. Now, again, this is something I just could have manually typed in, but this is a shortcut that I like to use here. So I'm going to, inside this cell, I will type in the VLOOKUP. And for the lookup value, it's going to be the customer ID. I'm leaving it blank for now. Eventually, I'll populate it with the customer ID that's inside the data worksheet. And the table array is going to be found inside the data worksheet. I'm going to go ahead and select the table array data, all of that information here. I'll go back to the lookup and oops, you know what? Let me go ahead and s- select the correct data. Yeah, this is the data that I want. And I'm going to put the absolute reference signs here. So I don't want my data, the data, the cells to shift. So I'm using the absolute reference. Then I will hit comma. And for the column index number, if I'm doing this for payment, let me go and see what number that is. I think that we said that was number 3. 1, 2, 3. It is. So I could go ahead and put the number 3 here, and I'll close the parentheses, hit enter. All right, so I got some sort of error. This happens all the time, and you're prone to make errors when you're trying to reference other worksheets. So let me see if I can pinpoint what happened here. Sometimes this is informative and you'll be able to tackle what the issue is, and sometimes it's not. And a lot of times, what I end up doing is I'll just start from scratch again. But let me just delete some of the information and see if I could. That'll work. Um, all right. Yeah, to just be on the safe side, I will start from scratch. So it's like that, which is a lookup value. The table array will be found here. And then I'll hit the number 3. Enter. Okay, good. So right now I'm getting an error, and that's just because I don't have a value here. So remember, I need to make sure that if I'm going to put a value in and try to look up that information, it has to be a value that's in this table array. Let's focus maybe on this customer ID. So let me just highlight that. So it's 10004, and the output is PayPal. So let's test this out. 10004, and it worked. Now I need to do the same thing, but for the source of payment. Um, Now let's see here. I didn't use the absolute reference when I created my first VLOOKUP, so let me just go ahead and add that in here. And I also want to do an absolute reference here because I want to eventually be able to copy and paste my VLOOKUP function to this blank cell, and then all I would need to do is just change this last number that represents the column. So I will hit copy, and then I will paste that in, and I have to just make that adjustment here, and source is going to be found on 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, the 5th column. So I'll go back to that and put in the number 5, and that is email, and focusing on this customer ID, their source is email. Right. So now anytime we put in a customer ID, let's say this customer, it's automatically going to just output based off of what the customer ID is. Now, one last thing to note is all of these things are working properly because I have my first column of data is sorted. Let me just go ahead and unhighlight this. And normally this is what you want to do is have your first column sorted, but practically speaking, sometimes you're faced with a data set and you don't have sorted columns, or at least the first column it won't be sorted. And I want to go ahead and mm, kind of unsort this customer ID column. So I will do that by going to transaction code and sorting that from largest to smallest. Now, taking a look at customer ID, these are not sorted in ascending order. And because of that, I end up getting errors here. The VLOOKUP function by default, it assumes that the first column of data values is sorted. Now, if it's not sorted, then you're going to want to pay attention to the last argument. So let me pull up that function. And that's the, in brackets, it's titled range underscore lookup. And if your first column is not sorted in order, then you would want to put a value of false. Now, if it is sorted, you can just leave it blank or put the value of true, and it will know how to look up that value. So I'll make some changes here. Now that my first column is no longer sorted, I will just go back to the VLOOKUP function that I did for payment, and I'm going to say false, and I'll hit enter. So now it knows how to look up that information, and it's aware that the lookup information, which happens to be that first column, is not sorted. So I'm going to do the same thing here. I'll go ahead and say false, and the information is now correctly outputted. Now, what's really cool about this lookup function, you don't really need to display this data tab here. So I can hide it and say, for example, somebody who wants to open up the spreadsheet and look up a customer. Um, then they'll be able to look up that customer and be able to retrieve that information on that customer without having to reference the data.